Welcome back to the Classical Theism podcast. We've got a special dialogue episode planned. My name is John DeRosa, and I'm joined by Jimmy Akin and Jordan Carstensen, who are going to be discussing whether the Kalam cosmological argument is sound, and in particular, can we show philosophically that the universe has a finite past? Jordan Carstensen is going to be arguing in favor of that. Jimmy Akin is going to be responding to him in dialogue. The format will be roughly as follows: brief 1 to 2 minute introductions from each participant to say a little bit about where they stand on the argument generally. Then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute opening statement from Jordan, a 5 to 10 minute response from Jimmy, and then approximately 30 to perhaps 40 minutes of open dialogue with light moderation from me. And then we'll have 2 minutes of closing statements at the end. But this came about because last year I had Jimmy on the show to try to convince him that the Kalam argument was sound and a philosophical version. I threw a bunch of stuff at him, and you know what? He had some very good objections, and it didn't quite work. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and now Jordan has developed some arguments and a few papers that he's written, and so he's ready to take the old try at can we convince Jimmy Akin that a philosophical version of the Kalam is sound. But Jimmy and Jordan, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Awesome
Thank
to be
you.
here.
Yeah, very nice to meet you, Jordan.
Nice to meet you too, Jimmy.
All right,
I'm
so we'll go to Jordan first. If you could just give 1 to 2 minutes, tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and then your overarching thoughts on the Kalam cosmological argument.
Okay, well, I'm Jordan Carstensen. I love philosophy. I'm Catholic. I'm a husband, a father. I'm an electrician. I like to study and learn everything. What my thoughts are on the Kalam, they've taken a roller coaster ride. Sometimes my degree of certainty has changed about it several times, and so I will say that currently, it seems to me that the objections that Jimmy has are beside the point, but I could be wrong about that. But it still seems to me so far that my argument is sound. Maybe that'll change by the end of the discussion. I don't know. But it's somewhat up in the air still. I'll say that. Although I will say, if you can show that some concept is very absurd, while that does not logically necessitate that it's false, it does give evidence that it's false. So if I think that if you conclude that some idea is absurd given your data, that is a good reason to think it is false. Like if you take examples like quantum mechanics, it was absurd at first, but it's not absurd given our data now. Given the empirical experience we do have, various aspects of quantum mechanics are not absurd any longer. However, various things that people could say about the concept of an infinite past are still just as absurd as they ever were, and no empirical observations has eased that absurdity. And so I don't think that those types of absurdities are identical to the ones in different aspects of physical science, etc. But that's kind of a side point because I'm going for the logical contradiction here. So yeah, okay. I don't know. Well, it's up in the air to some degree, but.
All right, so we'll get into more of the specifics of your argument shortly. And like you said, your position has evolved. I will say mine has evolved as well. Some of the listeners know my backstory with the argument. But Jimmy, let's kick it over to you. Where do you stand on the Kalam argument? Do you think it's a good argument for God? Give us some of your overarching thoughts about what you think.
Well, my name is Jimmy Akin. I love philosophy. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. I went to grad school in philosophy. I still think about it a lot. And I used to use the Kalam argument fairly regularly. I still use it in a modified way, but in order to make it work, you need to have a reason to think that the past is of finite duration. And you can argue for that either scientifically or philosophically. The scientific argument for it, to my mind, is the stronger of the two. It's not conclusive because nothing in science is ever conclusive. But I think it's the stronger of the two. I've never been impressed by the philosophical arguments for the finitude of the past, for the reason that God is omnipotent, and the classical understanding of divine omnipotence is that God can make any logically possible state of affairs actual. And so if you want to say God can't make a universe with an infinite past, you're going to, on the classical analysis, need to say that there's a logical contradiction in the idea of an infinite past. Now, some philosophers like William Lane Craig have deviated from the classical understanding of omnipotence, and they'll say, well, he can't do anything that's logically possible. He's only able to do things that are metaphysically possible. And then they seem to cash out metaphysical possibility in terms of absurdity rather than contradictions. So I think that if we're going for, can God do this? Since I have the classical understanding of omnipotence, I think you need to show a logical contradiction. And I appreciate the fact that Jordan is going to attempt to do that for us.
Excellent. Very good. So in a moment, we'll kick it over to Jordan for his opening statement. I'll just make a note that Jimmy did dialogue with Dr. William Lane Craig on this issue, which I'll link to in the show notes page that was on Pints with Aquinas. And just for the sake of it, I assume like our listenership has just heard it before, but since we're talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, I should probably just give a very basic statement of what it is. The first stage of the argument typically goes like this, nice and simple. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Therefore, conclusion, the universe has a cause. And then by doing a conceptual analysis of candidates and what this cause must be like, we can then argue that the cause is God, or probably God, or plausibly God, depending on how strong those supplementary arguments can be. And so what Jordan's here to do today is to defend the philosophical argument for that second premise, that the universe began to exist. So without further ado, oh, and by the way, just in case the audience was slightly confused, Jordan and Jimmy did have a little correspondence before the dialogue. So Jordan had mentioned that he was aware of Jimmy's objections and Jimmy aware of Jordan's opening statement. We had them share some of their arguments beforehand, just so they knew what to expect and they could plan some of their responses for a stronger open dialogue. But only their opening statement and opening remarks have been shared. And then when the dialogue comes along, we'll kind of see where the flow will go. So without further ado, Jordan, I'm going to share your slides presentation, and then I will turn it over to you for your opening statement. You can start whenever you're ready.
All right, ready to go. I'll begin by thanking Jimmy for having this discussion with me. I'm very appreciative of him as a careful and nuanced thinker, and it is a real honor for me to be able to have this conversation with him. I have a lot of respect for his work, and it is primarily because of Jimmy's criticisms that I had previously lowered my confidence in the arguments for the finitude of the past. In critiquing the arguments of prominent philosopher William Lane Craig on his blog post entitled Omnipotence and Infinite History, Jimmy says the following, quote, "If we want to say that God can't make a world with an infinite history, we need more than gesturing at a situation and saying it's absurd. We need to know what logical contradiction it involves. So far, Craig has not identified one, but that's what we need to see. Until he or someone else can show that the idea of infinite history involves a contradiction in terms and name the terms that conflict, any Christian who understands God's omnipotence should remain within the default position that this would be within God's power." Unquote. Regardless of whether or not God exists, we can use the idea of what is within the omnipotent God's power as a heuristic, which indicates logical possibility, which is what we're really concerned with. With that in mind, I intend to satisfy Jimmy's requirements today and prove by contradiction that the universe has a finite history. I intend to show that not even the omnipotent God could bring about a state of affairs that includes an infinite series of temporally extended changes which terminate in the present. I'm claiming that this is a logical impossibility, much like a four-sided triangle. Specifically, the hypothesis of an infinite past, which terminates in the present, involves a series which both has no limit and also does have a limit at the same time in the same sense. I do not believe that my arguments fall prey to the criticisms which Jimmy or others have elsewhere offered, such as the first and last fallacy, etc. Or at least I haven't found an error anywhere yet. I will say that because my argument, for all I can tell, has not been made before, I know that I should proceed with caution, and thus I fully admit I could be mistaken at one or more points, and if shown any mistake, I would change my mind accordingly. However, I have been trying to find out ways to refute my argument, and I still think that it succeeds, and so I will present it. But first, there are some helpful things to note, which will assist listeners in understanding what I'm about to say. The word finite means having a limit or boundary, whereas the word infinite means lacking a limit or boundary. When I'm talking about the earlier than and later than temporal directions of the universe, I'm simply referring to the fact that we can measure earlier and later events in the real world. We can order events from earliest to latest. On average, if not always, the cause is earlier than the effect when we are talking about multiple temporal states of the universe which have a causal relationship and which are not simultaneous. To say that time is a dimension of the universe simply means that there are or have been earlier and later states, and that these can be measured as earlier or later, or before or after. Presentists, growing block theorists, and eternalists can all agree that there is a time dimension and that events can be arranged in chronological order with earlier entities and events exerting causal influence on the existence and properties of later entities and events in virtue of the powers and properties inherent in the earlier entities and events. In other words, the existence and or specific properties of later events and entities are causally explained normally by earlier events and entities. In saying that an earlier temporal state of the universe gives rise to or causally explains a later temporal state of the universe, I personally am claiming that when the earlier state was present and actual, the later state was future and merely potential, not yet actually existing. Yet, once the later state becomes actual, its actual properties, which did not previously exist, come into being. I thus advocate for a doctrine that temporal becoming is an objective feature of the universe and not an illusion, such that the totality of all that actually exists at one time is not the same as the totality of all that actually exists at another time. Regarding the temporal ontology, which I find most plausible, I am a presentist. However, I believe that my arguments still remain sound if any one of a variety of temporal ontologies is correct, though perhaps with modification. The key aspect of a view of time that my arguments need in order to succeed is that time be dynamic rather than static and illusory. This can be true whether a presentist, growing block, or eternalist temporal ontology is correct, even though I personally prefer a presentist ontology. When I talk about a limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, I mean that there is some temporal state of which it is true that no times or temporal states later than that state have become actual or present. Jimmy says in his blog post entitled, "Are the Past and Future Real?" that he rejects the claim that time is an illusion or that it doesn't pass. He says that both of these claims are manifestly untrue, and eternalists shoot themselves in the foot when they say such things. And so it seems that he grants that necessary condition regarding time, which I need in order for my arguments to succeed. Further, on his blog post entitled "The Kalam Cosmological Argument and the First and Last Fallacy," Jimmy says that we can agree that the universe's history ends in the present. If a universe's history ends in the present, it has a final limit. This just is to say that the present time is the time in the later than direction to the history and series of changes of the universe. Is the limit in the later than direction to the history and series of changes of the universe. The series of events which have become present has a limit in the later than direction. In other words, to say that the present state of the universe is the limit in the later than direction is to say that no time or temporal state of the universe later than the present one has yet become present. The day which we presently refer to as tomorrow has not yet become present, even though it will become present. Regarding limits to extended series, it is helpful to think about various sorts of geometrical concepts. For instance, if you think of a ray, which has a starting point and then goes off infinitely into space in one direction, there's a limit in the one direction, but not the other. If you think of a line segment, there are limits in both directions along the single dimension. If you think of a line extending infinitely in both directions along the single dimension, then there is no limit in either direction. I think you get the idea. What I intend to argue is that the history of the universe cannot be like a ray, being infinite in only the earlier than direction, while also extending without limit into the direction in which it is limited, since this is incoherent. With these points in mind, I will lay out my primary argument, which is really two sub-arguments. The two distinct arguments help to make things clear and distinct and easier to digest. Here they are. Sub-argument 1, premise 1. Every change of the universe is a progression from a state further in the earlier than temporal direction and into a state further in the later than temporal direction. Premise 2. If the universe has an infinite past, then the universe has already changed an infinite number of times. Conclusion. If the universe has an infinite past, then the universe has already progressed further into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times. Subargument 2. Premise 1. If the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, then there is no limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction. Premise 2. There is a limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, namely the present state of the universe. Conclusion 1. The universe has not progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times. Conclusion 2. The universe has not changed an infinite number of times. Conclusion 3. The universe does not have an infinite past. To add one more note on this argument, so as to make it crystal clear, Jimmy and I both agree that if there is an infinite past, it is necessarily the case that if one was to single out any finite segment of time, for convenience sake, we can use the concept of a day, then it will have always been the case that an infinite number of distinct particular days have already occurred before any particular day that we select. No matter how far back in time we go, if the past is infinite, it would still be true that even if we select a day that was, say, 10 to the Google days later than today, or earlier than today, there would still have been an infinite number of days before that day that had already passed. So too, if we consider the number of days in eternity future that will become present, assuming that time never comes to an end, it is true of every single day that there are an infinite number of days that will become present in the future from the reference of whatever particular day we select. In other words, there are an infinite number of days after today that will come to pass, and if we single out a day that will become present 10 to the Google days after today, then there are still an infinite number of days after that day which will become present and pass later than and after it. My arguments simply show that if an infinite number of events or changes in a temporal series have already occurred, then the universe has already progressed infinitely without any limit into the later than direction, and that this implies that no matter what day anyone could select, it is necessarily true of that day that the universe has already progressed an infinite number of days further into the later than direction than that day. If we select the day which we presently call yesterday, then the hypothesis of an infinite number of changes into the later than direction implies that an infinite number of days later than yesterday have already become present and then passed. But today is the only day that has both become present and that is later than yesterday. And so it is false that an infinite number of days have become present which are later than yesterday. Thus, it is false that the universe has progressed into the later than direction limitlessly. Also, keep in mind that it is not necessary. There's not a problem necessarily with an actual infinite, nor with its formation. The problem is only and specifically that the hypothesis of an infinite number of events terminating in the present state of the universe right now implies a series that is both infinitely extended into a particular direction, specifically the later than direction, while also having a limit at the same time and in the same sense in that particular direction. I believe that I have illustrated the scenario sufficiently, and with that, we can let Jimmy have his turn. I'm gonna grab one thing too.
All right. Thank you, Jordan. That was just around 10 minutes, maybe like a few seconds over. So with that being said, we're going to turn it over to Jimmy for his initial response. And Jimmy, you should be able to share your screen now. And then after that, we'll have our open dialogue on the argument.
Okay.
So you can go ahead and share, and you please feel free to begin whenever you're ready.
So I want to thank Jordan for his engagement on this issue. I appreciate that, in particular, that his argument does not fall into some of the pitfalls that other people's arguments have. He's definitely steering clear of some of them. And I just appreciate his willingness to engage on this, and in terms that I think are the right ones, namely, is there a logical contradiction, and could an omnipotent God actually do this? So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. Y'all should be seeing this now.
Yes.
So my response has 3 segments. The first segment is just a clarification, and then I'll offer 2 critiques of Jordan's argument. By way of the clarification, I'm just clarifying a few points. I'm not actually arguing against Jordan here, but I don't believe that the following is essential to his argument. But I wish to point out I wish to point it out for purposes of clarification. Carstensen says that his argument is not dependent on the temporal ontology one holds, so it's compatible with presentism, growing block theory, and eternalist ontologies, and I appreciate that. I also appreciate his carefully noting that the existence, in his words, the existence and or specific properties of later events and entities are causally explained normally by earlier events and entities. This properly takes into account the possibility of retrocausation, which is often ignored in these discussions, but retrocausation is something we need to take into account. Carstensen says that he believes that temporal becoming or the passage of time is not an illusion, such that what actually exists at one time is not the same at what actually exists at another time, and I concur. What existed yesterday is not the same as what exists today. However, note the frame of reference markers in both what Carstensen and I have just said. In both cases, we specified a frame of reference for assessing what actually exists. Carstensen spoke of at one time and at another time, while I spoke of yesterday and today. The specification of a frame of reference is necessary, and since I'm an eternalist, I think that there is an additional frame of reference outside of time, which would be God's perspective or the eternal now. From the eternal now, all times are equally present or equally real. I think that's logically required if we are to avoid either making God the subject of time, so God would change, or of collapsing all of history into a single moment in which there is no change. Temporal becoming, thus, is something that Carstensen and I both believe in, but it's a phenomenon that occurs inside of time. However, God, being outside of time, sees and is present to all time simultaneously from his perspective. Carstensen quotes me as saying that we can agree that the universe's history ends in the present. If a universe's history ends in the present, it has a final limit. And I do think we can agree upon this, but in light of the preceding clarification, I need to say what this means from my perspective. In addition to being an eternalist, I also believe in an infinite future, which is something the Christian faith proclaims. I thus believe that discussion of endings or final limits must be qualified by a frame of reference. From an inside of time perspective, the natural frame of reference is today or now. And so by saying that an infinite past would terminate in today, I mean in terms of what is actually real. Each yesterday in an endless series of yesterdays was real at one time, but now only today is real. Tomorrow isn't yet real. It's thus in this sense that I can speak of an infinite series of yesterdays terminating with today, because today is the only thing that's real right now. Of course, I also believe that there will be an infinite future. So when tomorrow arrives, tomorrow will be real, and an infinite series of days would then terminate in what we presently call tomorrow. Jordan made this same point towards the end of his opening statement. However, this idea of an infinite future is not essential to the argument. An infinite future is not required for arguments about the length of the past. If God chose, he could have created an infinite past that terminates in the present with no future. So today would be the last day of all, kind of like the line of negative numbers terminates with 0. So with those clarifications as background, let's look at my first critique of Jordan's argument. The problem I see with it is premise 1 of subargument 2, which Jordan states as follows. Premise 1. If the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, then there is no limit to the progression of the universe into the later than temporal direction. My problem is this statement is ambiguous, and in the sense that Carstensen apparently intends it, it's false. The statement is ambiguous because a series can be infinite or unlimited in more than one way. Setting aside cardinalities higher than Aleph null, which is the cardinality of the set of natural numbers, the number line itself can be unlimited in three ways. First, the purest form of unlimitedness is bidirectional, with no limit in either direction, so that there's no beginning and no end. In his presentation, Jordan illustrated this with a line that stretches infinitely forward and infinitely backward. But we can also represent it by a numerical sequence of all of the negative numbers and all of the positive numbers, which we could represent -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. We'll call this bidirectional unlimitedness, sense one unlimitedness. Second, a number line may have a beginning limit, but no end limit. And Carsten represented that in his presentation with an array that has a beginning point, but no end point. And we can represent that numerically with the sequence 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. We'll call this unlimited future sense two unlimitedness. Third, a number line may have an end limit with no beginning limit. And Carstensen, Jordan didn't illustrate this, but it's essentially a flipped ray. It's a ray that proceeds infinitely from the past and terminates at some point. And we could represent that with the numerical sequence -3, -2, -1, 0, with no beginning to that series. We'll call this sense three unlimitedness. Premise one is true when understood in terms of sense three unlimitedness. That's the beginningless unlimitedness. If there has been an infinite past, then there is no limit to the progression of the universe into the later than temporal direction, in the sense that there have been an infinite or unlimited number of progressions towards the present, which we can represent by 0 on the number line. However, Carstensen needs premise 1 to contradict premise 2, which reads, there is a limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, namely the present state of the universe. From my perspective, this appears to just be a restatement of the sense in which premise 1 is true, and so it generates no contradiction. However, Carstensen takes it as contradicting premise 1, in which case he needs the statement, there is no limit to the progression of the universe, to be understood in terms of sense 1 or sense 2 unlimitedness. Another way of seeing this is by looking at the anatomy of premise 1. This is a conditional statement, an if-then statement, and if-then statements have two parts. The first part, the if part, is sometimes called the antecedent or the protasis, and the second part, the then part, is often called the consequent or the apodosis. However, if the consequent of this statement is understood in terms of sense 1 or sense 2 unlimitedness. So the idea would be that there is no limit on the progression of the universe into the later than temporal direction. If you understand that either in terms of having no limit in either direction, the infinite line segment in both, the infinite line in both directions, then that's not supported by the antecedent, the statement that the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times. The same thing is true if you take it in terms of sense 2, that it has no limit to its future. The antecedent thus envisions an infinite past. The statement, the statement, the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, that's supported. And Jordan illustrated this with his first sub-argument. That's only supported in terms of sense 3 unlimitedness, which is the idea of a line segment or a line that has no beginning and then terminates at an end point. Consequently, premise 1, if understood in a way that is contradictory to premise 2, it presupposes a form of unlimitedness that has not been established. If the consequent is taken in sense one or sense two, then this conditional overall is false. It's not. It's certainly unproven. It's not supported by the previous argumentation, and frankly, it would be false. Putting this another way, which I think will make it easier to see, we could frame the argument like this. So premise 1b, if there is an infinite past, then the number of days is unlimited. And that's true. The number of days is unlimited if we have an infinite past. But premise 2b, the past terminates in today, so there is a limit. Conclusion, therefore, there cannot be an infinite past. This argument is erroneous because it involves an ambiguity on the meaning of the term limit between premise 1b and premise 2b. It's the ambiguity I've just been discussing. The argument would be equivalent to saying, if the negative numbers are infinite, then the quantity of numbers is unlimited. But the line of negative numbers terminates in 0. Therefore, there cannot be an infinite quantity of negative numbers. If this argument worked, it would come as quite a surprise to mathematicians. However, it ultimately does not succeed because it involves the same ambiguity. If we try to eliminate ambiguity, we might get something like this, and I've added clarifying words in boldface and color. So this is Jordan's argument with just 2 additional clarifying words I've introduced. Premise 1, if the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, then there is no beginning limit to the progression of the universe into the later than temporal direction. And that's true. If the past is infinite, there's no beginning limit. Premise 2, there is a final limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, namely the present state of the universe. And that's true too. We've both agreed that the present is the end of the past. So there is a limit there. But these 2 premises about having no beginning limit and a final limit do not entail that the universe has not progressed into the later than direction an infinite number of times. So my fundamental point is that if Jordan's argument worked, it would prove too much. There's nothing specific about it that deals with a concept of infinite history. It would equally disprove the possibility of an infinite number of, for example, negative numbers. Anything that you can orient in a sequence, it would disprove the possibility of having a beginningless sequence, including a beginningless sequence of negative numbers. I'll very briefly touch on my second critique, which is that whenever examining an argument that would rule out the existence of an infinite past, it's helpful to flip the arrow of time and ask whether it also would rule out the existence of an infinite future, which happens to be an article.
Sorry to interrupt, Jimmy. I apologize. I was just going to say, that was about 13, 14 minutes. Do you want to save the second critique, or Jordan, do you want to hear him out on both critiques and then we'll dialogue about both? But if you'd prefer, we could dialogue about the first critique and then come back to the second critique. I just want to be a little bit fair with the time. Jordan, do you want him to just finish with the second critique, or would you rather focus in on that first critique first? My instinct is he put a lot on the table, so maybe we could focus on that first critique and come back to this one as time permits.
I would rather focus on the first one because that's the only one I'm worried about, if anything.
Is that okay with you, Jimmy? Or do you want to give a brief statement of this?
It's up to y'all. The second critique is much shorter than the first.
Okay, you know what? If it's much shorter, let's get it in, but then we'll agree, Jordan, you're going to get ample time to respond, and we'll focus in on that first critique. So, Jimmy, go ahead. I'm the host, so I'm going to be a little bit generous here, but Jordan, I promise you'll get as much time as needed to reply.
Okay, so it's helpful to ask, can this argument be turned around and applied to an infinite future? Well, This frequently just involves changing verb tenses from past to future. So premise one would become, if the universe will progress into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, then there is no limit to the progression of the universe into the later than temporal direction. There is a limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, namely the present state of the universe. And so the universe will not progress into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times. This would be equivalent to proving that because the line of positive numbers has a beginning limit of 0, there cannot be an infinite quantity of positive numbers that follow it. And the mistake can be made clear by reintroducing our clarifying words in terms of what kinds of limits we're talking about. If the universe will progress into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, then there is no ending limit to the progression of the universe in this direction. However, there is a beginning limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction, namely the present. But those two premises do not entail that the universe will not progress into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times. And so the logical possibility of an infinite future, which the Christian faith proclaims, is secure. But so is the logical possibility of an infinite past. And that's it.
All righty. John, we can't hear you, John.
Sorry about that. I was muted. Yes, thank you, Jimmy. I'm glad we let you have that second critique in because that was much shorter. So that was a total of around 16 minutes. But we'll now have our open discussion starting with Jordan. If you want to respond to any of the points that Jimmy made, and then we can have maybe a little bit of back and forth between you two. I'm going to try to bow out of the discussion for the most part, but I'll provide some light moderation and perhaps a question here or there to clarify. And you might have like multiple responses, Jordan, to each of Jimmy's points, but maybe if you want to just give your initial responses, one or two, and then you can go back and forth. Because if you list like too many things, then I know my head is going to be spinning and we're going to lose track. But maybe if you focus on a few of your core replies at a time, what you have to say in defense of your argument, and then Jimmy can have his turn. You two can go back and forth. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and Jordan, you can go ahead.
Okay. So basically my response, and before I give it, I just want to say, I grant I could be misunderstanding either your critique or the topic in general. It does not seem to me that I'm misunderstanding it, but essentially, it seems to me that Jimmy, it seems that you offered two different, not in like a mean way, but like parody arguments. They're parodying my arguments. You're showing, oh look, here's this argument. It's just like Jordan's. The logic's invalid here. Jordan uses the same logic, therefore his logic is valid too. It doesn't. The consequent does not is not implied by antecedent here. Well, Jordan does the same thing, so it doesn't work with his either. That's what it seems to me that you're doing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a parody argument, but I'm illustrating by comparable examples the flaw in the logic. Yes.
Okay, I thought that's what a parody argument was. Anyway, well, we agree though on what you're doing. So my problem is that in order to do that, I'm going to call it a parody. I don't know what else to call it, I guess.
That's okay.
Is there another word?
Well, so I would call it a parallel illustration.
Okay.
But call it whatever you want.
I'm just going to say parody because that's the easiest thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
So my problem is that your parody arguments, in order to be successful, in order to be sound, they need to be analogous to my arguments in the crucial and relevant senses, but they are not. Okay. So it seems to me that you are claiming that my premise one of sub-argument two is what you say, it's true in the sense three, the negative number line up to 0, right? You said it's true in sense three, but in that sense, in that case, I mean, there's an ambiguity and there's a limit in the sense that does not conflict with the sense in which it is true, right? That's what you're saying.
I'm saying there's one way of taking it that would be true, but then it won't generate the contradiction that you need.
Right. And so what I'm saying is that my sub-argument one, I got rid of that ambiguity, and I essentially, my sub-argument one was saying that if we have a sense three unlimitedness, that implies that we also have a sense one unlimitedness if the progression is without limit into the later than direction. So to go back to the sub-argument one, we'll just see if step by step if you agree with the premises.
Do you want me to pull it up on the screen, Jordan?
Yeah. Sub-argument
Okay.
one.
And you know what? Someone might have to give us a refresher on the sense one and the sense two and the sense three as you go along, but keep working.
Okay. So, well, I'll just ask first, do you disagree with any of sub-argument one, Jimmy?
Not off the top of my head. Not, I mean, I didn't have a huge amount of time to prepare for this discussion, so I went through things rather quickly. But I didn't see a problem until we get to sub-argument two.
Okay. So in my sub-argument one, I'm saying, so, if the every change, or at least changes on average, if not every change, changes on average, every change is from an earlier state and into a later state, right? If the universe has changed an infinite number of times, the universe has progressed into the later than direction without limit. Okay.
In terms of the total quantity, yes. But since there is a termination in the present, there is an end limit to that progression, namely the present. But the total quantity of changes is itself an infinite number.
Right. And so I guess I think that the number line is not analogous to changes of the universe.
Really interesting.
The number line is, it's an abstract object. It's unchanging. It's eternal truth, and you can. It doesn't progress. There's no objective fact about a progression to the number line in the sense that something about it changes.
Okay.
It's not. It's atemporal. It's outside of time. Whereas the universe, there's an objective fact that there is an arrow of time, and it goes one way. It goes toward the later than direction.
Okay,
but
so
if you want to talk about, go ahead.
Well, let me respond to that, because I think that even though it's true that there are disanalogies between the number line and the sequence of moments in history, like the number line is abstract, where the moments of history are concrete, I think they're relevant I think they're analogous in the relevant sense, because people use number lines to map history and to map specifically the progression of historical moments all the time. That's why this is 2023, last year was 2022, next year is 2024. I think the numerical number line mapping of the moments of history is extremely relevant here, which is why it's used all the time.
Okay. Well, let me give a specific line of questions and arguments to show the precise sense in which I don't think it's the number line is relevantly analogous to the progression of the universe. Okay. So let me ask you this. So when I talk about the concept of a limit, right? As I understand a limit to a series, I'm just gonna read this. As I understand the concept of a limit to a series, entity, or event as measured along some dimension, I understand a limit to be a point of which it is false that the series, entity, or extended thing proceeds further. It is some point of which it is false that the thing in question proceeds further, right? Or extends further.
Yes, though you have to specify the direction of progression. So you can have both beginning limits. There's no thing further towards the beginning than the beginning limit, and ending limits. There's nothing further towards the end than the ending limit. Right.
So, okay. So if so, then consider this thought experiment. So for whatever reason, I am situated on an infinite series of square tiles, which are laid in a straight line infinitely into both directions.
Okay.
People always travel one tile per step when they travel on these tiles, and they cannot skip tiles. I happen to know that all tiles in this imaginary world start out as black in color, but that whenever anybody steps on a tile, it becomes white permanently. Now imagine that I see white tiles as far as I can see in both directions, which is finitely far, okay? Next, I choose to walk into one of those directions, which I will call west. After I walk westward on, say, 1,000 white tiles, which are white because somebody before me had already stepped on them, I encounter a black tile in front of me, and the black tile's further west as far as the eye can see. Would you agree that the last white tile before the black tiles start would indicate that there is a limit to the progressive steps that anyone has ever taken into the westward direction?
Under the terms of the thought experiment, sure.
Okay. Would you agree that it is an incoherent idea to suggest that someone might have walked toward the west without any limit in the direction in which it is limited?
Under the terms of the
Go
thought
back to that.
experiment, yes.
Okay. So it seems to me if you agree to that, then my argument goes through and successfully shows that if you encounter a limit, that just is sufficient to show that you have not gone. Like if I'm facing this way and I find a limit right here,
Mm-hmm.
that's already sufficient to show that I have not gone that way without limit.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if we're talking about the days and the progression of the universe, if it has reached a limit, whatever direction that limit is in indicates that we have not gone that way without limit.
Sure.
So the present moment is the limit the limit in the later than direction beyond which the universe has not progressed, right?
Sure.
But that just means we haven't gone without limit into the later than direction, right?
Correct.
But that means that we haven't changed an infinite number of times.
No, unless you presuppose a beginning limit, it does mean it means exactly that. In which case, you'd be committing the first and last fallacy. If we're agreed that there is no beginning limit, then all you've described is an ending limit. And so, if I'm proceeding along through history and I hit the present, and that's my end limit, the only way for the past to be infinite is if there's no beginning limit. If you impose a beginning limit, then you've just made the stretch of the past finite. So either you're not describing an infinite past, or if you are describing an infinite past, then all you've established is an infinite past would have a terminus or a limit in the present. Just like if you are talking about a line of negative numbers, then they terminate at 0, but there is no first negative number. And that's the only way that the line of negative numbers can be infinite, is if there's no first negative number, if there's no beginning limit.
Okay,
Jordan,
so,
I wonder.
So then you.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I want to let Jordan respond, but I wonder if I could interject a question that maybe focuses your argument, Jordan, because to me, it seems that the direction you want to go with this is that you don't think if the past is infinite that we could even have anything like a present moment. You don't even think it's possible to conceptually have a present, whereas Jimmy thinks we can, and we do have a present, even if per the hypothesis the past is infinite, there still could have been a present. So maybe I'll let you respond, but maybe you could say a little bit more about why you don't think it's possible to have a present moment, given your argument and the scenario you've been working on.
Okay, so if you're going to say that there's an infinite past and we've changed, the universe has progressed without any limit toward the later than direction, and also there's a limit in the later than direction.
Okay,
that just seems straightforwardly contradictory to me.
And taking it one way, it would be. That's why in analyzing your argument, I was trying to read the premises charitably, in a way that made the most sense. And it's true, if you have an infinite past that terminates in the present, it does have a final limit. And then there's a question of how do you take this language about it's progressed in the later than direction an infinite number of times. That can be taken more than one way. It could be taken to mean it progresses with no final limit, but that would be contrary to the supposition. So I took it in the other way, which just means it's progressed in this direction an infinite number of times. The quantity of progressions leading up to the terminal limit is infinite. And so I was trying to be charitable. That's why in my response, I restated at one point to clarify this is the sense in which I'm taking this. Because if you say there's no final limit, but there is a final limit, that's obviously a contradiction. So I had to take the statement that it's progressed in this direction an infinite number of times in terms of the quantity of progressions, and not not is there a final limit, because there has to be a final limit on this model.
Okay, so let's forget about whether or not it has a final limit for temporarily. Go back to the first sub argument. If the universe has progressed into the later than direction without limit, okay, you're saying it can also have a limit in the later than direction?
Yes, because the term limit is ambiguous. This is why I was talking about the ambiguity in the statement. We have to talk about what kind of limit are we talking about. Is it a beginning limit, an ending limit, a quantity limit? Is it unlimited?
The argument specifies.
Well, it does.
It specifies exactly what sort of limit I'm talking about. I thought.
So John has put up your second sub-argument, which is the one at issue. You say, if in premise one, if the universe has already progressed into the later than temporal direction an infinite number of times, there is no limit to the progression of the universe in the later than temporal direction. Okay.
I'm not talking about the cardinality. I'm talking about the specific direction in which it is limited.
Okay, well, if you mean that, then I would say that premise is just false, because there is a limit. And so
I'm saying, but there wouldn't be had we gone that way without limit. There shouldn't be. If we've gone this way without limit, there should be no limit that way.
Only if you're presupposing a beginning. So we're dancing with the first and last fallacy again. If you don't presuppose a beginning, then we can have a series that terminates after an infinite number of progressions with a specific day or number or whatever you want to use as a mapping system. Just like I could have an infinite series that starts with 0 and has no end limit, and that would be infinite.
I guess I don't think I'm presupposing a first member. I think I tried to argue that if the universe is I'm using your sense 1, sense 2, sense 3. Maybe you can pull that up on your screen.
Yeah.
I mean my first sub argument, the whole argument is saying if the universe is infinite in sense 3, then it is also infinite in sense 1. That's what my first argument establishes.
Okay, let me get that up. Here are the senses. So you're saying what now?
I'm saying, so my first sub argument shows, unless something's false about or ambiguous about, which I don't think it is, but I could be definitely wrong. I'm showing that if the universe is unlimited in sense 3, then it is also unlimited in sense 1, specifically because there's something true of the progression of the universe, namely that it goes into one specific direction without any limit. In sense 3, there is a limit, but the universe, if it's progressed in one particular direction, does not have a limit in that progression.
Okay, I would say two things. The first one is, if I don't think your argument shows that, but if it did, all you would do is prove both an infinite past and an infinite future. If sense 3 entails sense 1, then sense 3 is possible, therefore sense 1 would be guaranteed. And I don't think that's the case, but that's a conclusion I would draw if the argument worked. However, I don't think it works, because sense 3 does not imply sense 1 on a number line. I can have an infinite set of negative numbers, and it doesn't imply anything about will there be future numbers. Now, in mathematics, there are, but if we're mapping a historical sequence, the fact that we have an infinite past historical sequence does not entail the reality of an infinite future historical sequence. Similarly, if we have in sense 2, if we have an infinite future historical sequence, that doesn't tell us anything about, does an infinite past also exist? So what the number line does for us is it shows us what's logically possible. And an infinite past is logically possible. We then have to say, okay, what evidence do we have about what's real? And the reality is we have evidence from the faith that the past is finite. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we also have evidence that the future is infinite because we'll have eternal life. But that's faith data. That's not what's logically possible. What's logically possible is broader than that.
Okay. One of us isn't getting something, and it's probably me, but I'm going to try one more time to show why sense 3 does imply sense 1.
Please do.
Okay. So, subargument 1, premise 1. Every change of the universe is a progression from a state further in the earlier than temporal direction into a state further in the later than temporal direction. Premise 2.
John, why don't you put those up so we can follow all that together?
Sorry, go ahead.
Premise 2. If the universe has an infinite past, then the universe has already changed an infinite number of times.
True.
Conclusion. If the universe has an infinite past, then the universe has already progressed further into the temporal direction without limit. That's the same thing as Well, maybe
and that's true. It has already progressed into the later than direction an infinite quantity of times.
Yeah. Well, I think you want to say without ending limit, Jordan. Is that what you mean? Without an ending limit?
Because it hasn't done it.
If that's what limit in the later than direction. All right. Does it?
You say an infinite number of times.
Okay, right. Then I get right. So I'm trying to say, that's right. So my first premise in the next argument, I'm saying if we have gone that way an infinite number of times, there's no limit to the progression that way that we have gone. But if you're saying that there's a zero here stopping it, well, it hasn't gone that way an infinite number of times. Because if it had, it would be without limit.
Okay. It seems to me that you're thinking of infinite sequences only in the future direction in terms of sense 2 of a line ray beginning in the present and having a beginning limit but no end limit. And that's what I'm not doing. You can either have something that's infinite in both directions. You can have you can have a beginning limit but no end limit, or you can have an end limit with no beginning limit. But there's taking the latter two cases, sense 2 and sense 3. If sense 1 is a genuine infinity, you have a beginning limit and there's no end, and that's infinite, then there's nothing contradictory if you flip the direction and say we've got an end limit that has no beginning. That's also going to be infinite. So it seems to me that in interpreting your second premise, your first premise of your second argument, there's a choice to be made between, are we talking about progressing an infinite number of times, in which case with an infinite history, it's true. We've progressed an infinite number of times to get up to the present, which is our end limit. Or are you saying if we've progressed an infinite number of times, there is no end limit? That's only true in sense 2, where you have a beginning limit. And so you either have to adopt sense 1, the quantity of progressions is infinite, but there is a terminal limit, or you have to presuppose a beginning limit in order to say that you can't have a terminal limit.
Yeah, I guess I just don't see at all that I'm presupposing a beginning limit. So
well,
I don't not be getting something, but I can.
Well, here, maybe Jordan, here, can I explain it, or can I ask you to justify it one more time? Because I think Jimmy's asking a very good question in that you seem to be arguing as a crux of your position that if the universe has progressed an infinite number of times into the later than direction, then it can't have a specific ending limit, namely the present day. And so what he's asking you is,
why not?
Why not?
Because that would contradict what it means to say limitless in that direction.
Except
if we
it
go
doesn't.
This way without any limit, there can't be a limit that way.
Except it doesn't. That's why I distinguish the three senses of unlimitedness. You can have unlimitedness in both directions, as in the case of the set of all natural numbers. You could have a beginning limit with no end, as in the case of the positive numbers, or you could have an ending limit with no beginning in the case of negative numbers. And all three of those are infinite. In fact, they all have the same cardinality. every one of those sets has a cardinality of A left null. So all three of those sets are infinite. And therefore, I conclude that if we are mapping the sequence of historical events with the negative numbers, there's no problem in saying there's no beginning moment to the sequence of history, just like there's no beginning to the sequence of negative numbers, but there is a terminal limit in the present. That's why I said if your argument worked, it would not only disprove an infinite history, it would disprove an infinity of negative numbers as well.
Well, so your parity arguments, they're posed as if I had some problem with any limit to an infinity, which I don't. I just have a problem with a limit to an infinite series, which is allegedly unlimited in the direction in which it's apparently limited.
Well, it's not
I don't have a
unlimited.
problem with
It's not unlimited in a particular direction. It terminates in the present. There is a limit there. The sense in which an infinite series with a terminal limit is infinite is it's infinite in the preceding direction and everything leading up to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have to watch this later, but it still seems to me that if it has changed an infinite number of times into the later than direction, then without presupposing a beginning at all, I really don't think I am. If we have changed without limit into the later than direction, it seems that the sense one ought to be true. We ought to be limited in both directions, but that isn't the case, as is shown by the present moment. But let me try one more thought experiment to try to illustrate, and maybe this will help clarify it.
Yeah. Thought experiment. That's a better word than parity argument. Yeah, I like that.
So, okay, so back to my tile world, right?
Okay.
So let's say I plop down, black tiles are ones that have never been stepped on. White ones are ones which have been stepped on, right?
Sure.
So if I do start here, which in this case I am presupposing the beginning, but it's just the start of the thought experiment. If I start here and I walk infinitely to the west, it is necessarily true of every single tile that there are an infinite number of tiles further to the west than that tile, whatever tile we select.
Not if you've done it infinitely. Well, let me make sure I understand your direction of travel first. So you're standing on tile 0, and you're going to walk. Are you walking east or west?
Well, real quick, I don't want to label any of the tiles because I think that the number line thing is very misleading, and it gives people the false impression that, oh, there's a natural landing point for this limitless progression. But on the number line, nothing progresses. There is no. It's as if.
No, like, it's a mapping of a historical progression. This is 2023. Last year was 2022. Next year is 2024. It's a way of conveniently mapping historical progressions. I mean, you yourself it said in your opening presentation that we can arrange moments of events in the history of the universe in a sequential order, and all I'm doing is using a mapping system by applying numbers to those. But let's say you're standing on a tile. Are you going to walk east or west?
I'm walking west.
You're walking west. Okay. Well, if you walk west with no limit, then you will have stepped on all of the tiles to the west of your initial tile, whether you want to call that tile 1 or tile 0 or tile unnumbered. You're going to step on all of them. And so there will be no further tiles in that direction
that I haven't stepped on.
That you have not stepped on.
So every tile will have an infinite number of tiles to the west of it, which are white because they have been stepped on if I complete that series.
Correct.
Okay. And that is necessarily true in that circumstance.
Yes. You can't complete the series in a finite amount of time, but that would be true.
Right. So if that's necessarily the true in that case, why does it somehow become possibly true if we add the detail that there's also an infinite number of tiles in the east from which I have already come from the east without a starting point?
Why does what become true?
So it seems to me that if it's necessary in the one case that there are an infinite number of tiles beyond any tile to the west, if I have a starting point, I don't see why lacking a starting point and having always come without beginning from the infinite east and gone that way to the west, I don't understand how that necessary truth somehow becomes merely a possible truth.
So I'm not 100% sure what you're saying here, but let me take a stab. Let's suppose you've been walking westward from the east for an infinite amount of time. You will have stepped on all of the tiles if you're coming from the east and you've been walking westward for an infinite amount of time, you will have stepped on all of the tiles leading up to the one you're about to step on now. And then you step on that one. So you're going to have an infinite series of white tiles stretching off to the east. If you then keep going for an infinite amount of time, you'll step on all the western tiles too. But you haven't done that yet. You've just been walking for an infinite amount of time past leading up to the present tile that now turns white when you step on it.
Okay, so how could it be that there's a limit to the tile? So we agreed earlier that if there's a black tile in front of me, that last white tile is the limit to my progression westward, right?
Correct.
How could it be that I have, for all eternity, walked westward and yet have any black tiles?
Well, that's your thought experiment. You're the one who set it up.
Well,
You said we've got this infinite stretch of black tiles. When you step on them, they turn white. If I've been walking down them, or you've been walking down them, or someone's been walking down them for an infinite stretch of time, then you will have arrived at some point. And since the sequence in front of you is unlimited, there will be a black tile in front of you at every step, because you can't complete this. You can't, in a finite amount of time, or in an amount of time, it doesn't even have to be finite, in an amount of time that has a terminal limit of the present, you will not have reached all of the future tiles. And so there will be a last white tile and a first black tile that corresponds to the decision, to the border between today and and tomorrow.
okay, and I get so like when you say that, if we walk to the west without limit, all of them to the west from that point will have been stepped on, will be white, right?
Yeah.
I guess it seems to me that if we have always walked west, coming infinitely from the east without beginning, from the infinite eastward direction to the infinite west, it seems to me that there can be no tile, which I have already failed. It seems that all of them would have to be stepped on.
There can't be, the way you just said it, from the infinite west to the infinite east. If you've walked from the infinite west to the infinite east, then yeah, they're all stepped on. But that doesn't mean that you can't have been walking for an infinite amount of time to arrive at the current tile, and there are still an infinite number of tiles to come.
I guess I just don't understand.
Well, here we've kind of run its course on the first critique. I know, I apologize. I got to be the big bad host here because I have to go soon. So I don't know if we'll have time to discuss the second critique, but I know, Jordan, you're going to be listening back to this and seeing what you think of your argument and Jimmy's replies. I'm kind of trying to follow along. It did get a little bit tricky there when we were talking about the different senses of time, but I think the walking east and west we've been able to follow. Yeah, Jimmy, did you want to make a final point? And then we'll kind of go into closing soon.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, I know this is some heady stuff, and I started with a draft response that was even headier than the one I read, and I've been able to modify it down. But unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this. I would have loved to be able to bring this down to an area that will be easier for non-specialists to understand. And that might help our discussion as well. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that.
Yeah, and what we'll do is, with Jimmy and Jordan's permission, I'll definitely going to be posting the video version. Perhaps we can post the slides as well, if that will be helpful to people. And Jordan, if you do further writing on this and some of Jimmy's blog articles, we can kind of compile all of that into the show notes page. But why don't we just go into a brief closing statement of 1 or 2 minutes of your thoughts on the discussion and your argument and the critiques, and maybe perhaps where you see it may be going in the future, if we can use that term. But Jordan, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Jimmy.
I guess my current thoughts on it are: it just seems to me that the universe cannot progress that way without limit, and then reach a limit beyond which it's further than which it has not gone. And Jimmy just is saying that you can do that, and I don't know how either of us could. I don't know. I guess I need to dig in to see how I can better understand this, because it seems to me if I have reached a limit, that is a sufficient condition for me to know that I have not gone that direction, the direction in which the limit is, limitlessly. If I see a limit, I haven't gone that way limitlessly, right? That's what it seems to me. But
unless
Jimmy,
you have, well, I think
this.
he's saying unless you had a finite, you're assuming a finite starting point. You're assuming
I'm not assuming a starting point.
Okay.
Jim, you maybe, he says I am, but I don't think I am.
Well, no, I think that there's a confusion here. I don't want to interrupt your closing statement.
No,
Why don't you?
That's all right.
Well, I think that there's a confusion here, and I encounter this with a lot of Kalam defenders, philosophical Kalam defenders, where they'll say, "I'm not presupposing a limit," but you examine their line of reasoning, and they are without realizing it. Because you can progress in a given direction for an infinite amount of time, and yet it can have a limit. It can either be a beginning limit after which you progress an infinite amount of time, or it can be an ending limit prior to which you've been progressing an infinite amount of time. The only way to say that an infinite series can't terminate with a limit is if you're presupposing it has a beginning. Because if you presuppose it has a beginning and an end, then it's finite. It's limited in both directions. What the term finite means in terms of a sequence is limited in both directions. And if you remove either limit or both, it becomes an infinite series. And you can have either any of the three flavors of infinite series, which are conveniently mapped by a number line. Just to make this my closing statement, I think the number line is a good mapping system. Even though it's a static system, it's relevant for mapping history, which is why everybody uses it for mapping history. I would therefore, and consequently, I don't think the argument. One of the points I've made in prior discussions of this, including in some of my writings, is a lot of the arguments trying to show that an infinite history involves a logical contradiction really aren't about infinite histories at all. They're about things like hotel rooms or something else, and they're not about history. If you want to show that something involves a contradiction in infinite history, you need to show something about the nature of time that would involve a logical contradiction. I don't think there is one. So in thinking about how to, if I were going to be arguing for the Kalam or trying to steelman Jordan's argument, I would either focus more on the nature of time, or I would focus on at least attacking why is the number line not analogous to history in the relevant sense. And I'd have to be able to name that relevant sense and argue for it, because otherwise it looks to me like the argument would just as much disprove an infinite series of negative numbers on my first critique or an infinite series of positive numbers on my second critique. So I don't think it's unique to history.
Thank you, Jimmy, for that. Thank you, Jordan. Jordan, I do apologize, though, because I interrupted your closing statement initially. Did you have one final thought that you wanted to share? Because I wanted to give you that option. And then feel free, both of you, to let listeners know where they can go to find out more about your writings, your arguments. I'll definitely link to things in the show notes page. But Jordan, did you have another thought before I apologize for interrupting you again?
I mean, I have several. I did have some stuff prepared to show how a number line is disanalogous to the progression of the universe, but I mean, I think Jimmy's just going to say, "Oh, I'm not disanalogous enough."
I might.
It seems to me like it would be analogous to a static, four-dimensional block universe, which just is all at once. But that's not the universe we live in, and so I mean, there's a number of reasons why. Like, there's an objective arrow of time that we move. It moves from past. Are you a moving spotlight theorist?
No, I'd have to know how you're defining that term. I believe that the past and the future are real from God's perspective. So there is an infinite block in front of God from the eternal perspective, but I pass through that block one moment at a time in my life.
That seems to be. So would you say it is objectively true that there's something special and privileged about the present moment that is not true of, say, tomorrow? Or
From
do you think
my
tomorrow?
from my perspective, yes. From God's perspective,
Okay.
no.
So I would say that is a spotlight theory. So I guess, and I think the spotlight, if I'm if I'm right about some other things, which obviously don't think I am, then I think my argument works according to the spotlight theory. What I was going to say was, if we live in just a B theory 4-dimensional block universe, then in that case, it does seem to me that the number line would be analogous to it.
Mhm.
The reason I don't see how the universe can both progress without limit that way and also reach a limit that way further than which it fails to go. The reason I think that, and it seems to me you're saying you can do that, right?
Well, I'm in terms of what's logically possible, I can imagine God
Right.
creating a universe with any length of history he wants in either direction. So just like he has created a universe with an infinite future and a beginning, he could create a universe with an infinite past and an end. Or he could create a universe that has an infinite history with no beginning or no end. What he can't do, because it's a logical contradiction, is create a universe that has an infinite history with both a beginning limit and an end limit, because that's by
Okay.
definition a finite universe.
Okay. So would you agree that I know? Sorry, John. Uh, um, do you think that there can be, and I don't. So,
Mhm.
but do you think that there can be a starting point to the universe infinitely far ago,
No,
infinitely in the past? Okay.
no,
And why is that?
that's a logical contradiction. That's the first and last fallacy. That's like saying there's a final moment in the future that's infinitely far away. Well,
Right.
if it's truly infinite, then it's not a final moment. If the future is truly infinite,
And I'm saying the same thing about the present. Is that you? That's like saying that the present is uh, infinitely. It's at the end. It's the limit to a limitless progression. The present is. It seems that that's what you have to claim,
no.
and that seems incoherent to me.
No, the only reason I can say there's no future final moment infinitely far away is because I'm taking now as the starting limit. And consequently, if I say there's a final moment, it is by definition finitely far away because we have both a beginning and an end limit. If I take a so consequently, if I can't what I can't say is there's a beginning moment infinitely in the past that terminates in the present. It's not a beginning moment if it's infinitely far away. So if I take away there's no first moment, then the past can be infinite. In fact, that's the only way that the past can be infinite is if there's no first starting point.
All right, I apologize because I really have to call
Mhm.
Yeah.
time there,
No.
Jordan. But is there an avenue you want to point listeners to, or things you might explore in the future? I'll just say, if they want to become a patron of the Classical Theism podcast, Jordan's in our small group where we meet every so often to talk about philosophical issues like this. But Jordan, anywhere you want to point listeners towards to see your writings in the future, or I'll be able to throw things up in the show notes page. Anything you're interested in, or a final statement you want to make on what you're exploring.
Um, I don't. I mean, you can't. I don't have a website or anything like that. I'll just say that this conversation makes it's narrowing my focus of what I need to figure out next, and it still seems to me that Jimmy is just asserting some things. He's like asserting that I'm presupposing an infinite past, but I just don't think I am. And it's so far, and don't get me wrong, this could change after reflection. So far, it still seems to me that to claim that the universe has changed an infinite number of times is to claim that it has gone without limit that way until it reaches its limit, which in my mind is just to say that it hasn't gone limitlessly that way. But again, I need to listen to this over again multiple times, and perhaps I will see Jimmy's point or change my mind. But As of now, I'm confused about it.
All right. Well, it's been a very interesting discussion. Jimmy, where do you want to point listeners to, especially on this topic, things you've done,
Yeah.
perhaps?
So I want to say thank you to Jordan, and I wish him good luck in his continued work, and I'll be happy to offer my thoughts if he has future work on this that he'd like to discuss. For my prior discussions of the Kalam argument, I have some, you can look at an interview I did with Pints with Aquinas with Bill Craig. I've discussed it previously here on classical theism, and also I've written about it at jimmyakin.com. That's JIMMYAKIN. There are no E's, T's, or S's. Just akin.com/Kalam.
All right, very good. Well, I'll make sure to have all that in the show notes page with some slides, some supplementary materials. But thanks again to Jordan and to Jimmy for joining us today. It's been a blast.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciate it. I will definitely consider this stuff a lot more than what you've said.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, John.
My pleasure.